Today is the 19th of July, 2016. The topic is the 80th anniversary of the Spanish Civil War, which lasted 3 years from 1936 to 39. My wife, Lois, and I met in January of 1954 at the University of Michigan. And the first time we met, we spoke about our interest in the Spanish Civil War. And we've been discussing that issue ever since.
60 plus years.
Right. Now, I had a interest in the moral development of democracy, and that's how I began my interest in the Spanish Civil War, because the democratic constitution of Spain was being threatened by various totalitarian movements. And the Civil War began when I was 6 years old. I didn't remember it at the time, but I learned about it 2 years later in 1938. And Lois was 4 years old then, and she learned about it soon thereafter. And in 1954, both Lois and I were interested in American political democracy. And the fate of democracy in England, France, Spain, Italy, and the United States and Germany are kind of tied together. And that's why we are finding that subject still of interest today.
Yes, and I wanted to point out, Bob, that a lot of Americans especially confuse the Spanish-American War, which occurred in 1898. They confuse that with the Spanish Civil War, which was one of the things that brought on soon, was just before World War II, as you mentioned, 1936 to 1939. But there is a certain
personal connection.
And one of the big things I think is a personal connection is the fact that the winner of the Spanish Civil War on the Spanish side was
on the right, on the Spanish right, yeah.
On the Spanish right was the dictator, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who came from a military family in western Spain. And his father was interested in the Navy and was a naval official. But because the Spanish-American War occurred when Franco was only 6 years old, Spain lost her colonies. What colonies she still had left. She had lost most of the colonies in Latin America during the Napoleonic Wars, or just after the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. But at the end of the 19th century, basically the rest of Spain's colonial empire was lost to whom? Us, the Americans.
Okay.
Philippines and Cuba.
Can I interrupt briefly to mention that the title of this show and the name of this show is Athens Speakout number 374. And I'm going to give a little outline of our procedure. Lois and I will talk about the causes and the results of the Civil War. And since I'm an expert on the subject, she's going to be asking me most of the questions, most of the details. And I'm going to save my energy to the last 15 minutes and talk about the results as well as the causes, namely that the Spanish Civil War led to World War II, and in an indirect way to the Korean War and the Vietnam, and to the 6 Arab-Israeli wars still in present, because communism was one of the major issues involved in Spain, and unfortunately, it is still with us in some Republican parties' hands.
Particularly, and of course, we should mention contemporary events here briefly, that the Republican National Convention is meeting as we speak in Cleveland, Ohio, and getting ready to nominate Donald Trump as presidential candidate for their party.
But one topic they will not discuss is the Spanish Civil War. That is a taboo.
Quite likely, although it's very interesting that they began on the 18th of July, which is the exact 80th anniversary of the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in Spain on the 18th of July in 1936.
And why did it break out then?
Why did it break out then? Well, you have to look back at the recent history of Spain in the 1920s and 30s. And, where did, say, Generalissimo Franco, where did he come from? Quite aside from the fact that he had this background as a naval family, but he went to the military academy. He graduated in 1910 and almost immediately at least, went to Spanish Morocco, where Spain was taking over about a fifth of the territory of Morocco. And France had, they didn't have exactly a colony, but they had a kind of a protectorate over Morocco at the time. And the French and the Spanish had agreed that there would be this Spanish part of northwestern Morocco right across from the Straits of Gibraltar. You know.
As long as we're talking about Morocco and Islam, Franco had a very simple answer to how to bring discipline to the rebellious Moroccans. He learned that in Islam, if you lose your head, you can't go to heaven. So he says to his Spanish brutal officers, go out there and take a sample and behead the first 15 guys you see, and they'll obey the Spanish Foreign Legion.
Well,
that's how he got disciplined.
That could be, but it's interesting that his whole army career was very closely tied with Morocco from 1910 until 1926, when finally the Spaniards managed to pacify, shall we say, the Moroccans who did not want to be ruled by Spain.
Or by the French.
Or
there
by
was
the
a
French.
Spanish Morocco and a French Morocco.
Yes, there was.
And an independent zone called Tangier,
Right.
which had no terrace.
And that was near the Straits of Gibraltar.
That's right. And the British designed that, French Morocco, Spanish Morocco, and Tangier, in order to protect the British sea base at Gibraltar.
Right,
And
which
that's
they
the-
had seized during the Napoleonic Wars. I
No.
believe. Was it even earlier? Bob?
The War of Spanish Secession,
Oh, my goodness.
1704,
Uh-huh.
and in 1713, the peace treaty deeded it forever to the British Empire.
So it's it's a complex historical situation.
Right.
Right there we have the Spanish, the French, and the English all interested in northern Morocco, Straits of Gibraltar, and so on.
And Franco and Mussolini and Hitler became interested in that strategic waterway.
Yes.
That's
of
why
course.
they intervened.
Right. Well, we sort of forgot about Mussolini these days, but Mussolini was actually the first fascist dictator, the first fascist leader.
Right.
He was called Il Duce, the leader. And then following him, he came to power in 1922.
Correct.
Following him in 1933 was Der Führer, the leader,
Adolf Hitler.
Adolf Hitler. And eventually, Francisco Franco became the leader of the Spanish
And he called himself
Falange,
El Caudillo.
El Caudillo, but all of them mean
And gave the fascist salute.
all of them mean leader. And the fascist salute was something from the Roman Empire that Mussolini reintroduced.
That's correct.
So that's why fascism still has this Italian name, you might say.
That's true.
So that was part of the background. Well, like I say, Franco had been in Morocco for, like 15 years, and many Spanish officers and soldiers were killed, as well as the Moroccans in that fight, that long fight. But Franco survived, and he became the youngest general in Europe. He was a general when he was about age 30.
The rest of Europe weren't in combat.
Well, he managed. He survived. And
that is after the First World War,
it was
1919.
after the First World War, yes.
Europe was at peace, and Spain was a neutral power in the League of Nations.
Right, and Spain had been a neutral power.
The League of Nations. I said United Nations.
League of Nations.
League of Nations.
League of Nations.
Did I make a slip?
I thought you said league,
Well,
but maybe
okay.
I just heard it that way.
Okay.
Anyway, Franco, after his Moroccan adventures, was named to head a military academy in Spain, and so he was around in the 1920s. Like I say, he was already a general in the 1920s. So. Spain was a monarchy. One of the great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria was Alfonso XIII, the last king of Spain before the current Juan Carlos.
But more important than Queen Victoria was the Bourbon dynasty of France.
Okay.
And the French Bourbon kings established Bourbon kings on the Spanish throne.
Mm-hmm.
So Alfonso's name was Alfonso Bourbon.
Aha.
Now there were a group of Spaniards who thought he was illegitimate.
Oh, well, this was part of
The long history of
Austrian.
it was
Austrian
once
background.
a Habsburg. It was once a Habsburg family.
A Habsburg family, which was headed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
Right.
which was broken up by World War I, actually.
That's
the
true.
Austro-Hungarian
That is true.
Empire.
That is true.
So anyway, Alfonso left Spain in 1931, and the Second
He
Republic.
fled voluntarily in 31
Yes, he left Spain in 31.
and fled to Rome
Yeah. Where no doubt he had some
and had
friends.
Mussolini's protection.
Yes, Alfonso XIII, and it's eventually his grandson who became the current king of Spain
That is correct.
after the death of Franco,
That's
long
true.
years later.
True, true.
Well, this is part of the complex history of
That's right.
the Second Republic, Spanish Republic, lasted from 1931 to 1939, but the Civil War broke out on July 18th, 1936, when Spanish military leaders.
Well, actually, there are two dates,
Yes.
the 17th and the 18th.
Well, yeah,
That gets back to Morocco.
so it does.
Franco had a friend, Colonel Bagbadir.
Bagbadir.
Yeah, Bagbadir in Morocco. Mm-hmm. So Franco, when he joined the coup, sent a message to Bagbadir, we're going to have a revolution. Bagbadir seized it first, so they already seized Morocco on the 17th. Mm-hmm. And then the 18th is when the peninsula, Spanish peninsula goes into
The Spanish Peninsula
has the
rose up
right,
with
right.
the leftists and the rightists. The republic itself was headed by a left coalition, which had been elected in 1936 in February.
That's correct.
Very close election, but the
That's-
left party coalition won.
That's right.
And so they were forming the government.
That's correct.
And immediately they made some moves against the military and the church and the big landowners and, all these.
There was a social divide in Spain,
Yes,
which was severe
yes,
as the French social divide in 1789.
yes, which caused the outbreak of the French Revolution.
Right, and
Yeah.
it was somewhat severe in the Soviet Union in 1917.
Yes, indeed.
It was a real revolution.
It was. Well, so these Spanish military officers began plotting against the elected Republican government on the left, which was what they called a Popular Front government. Can you explain what the Popular Front was?
Well, the Popular Front, as an idea, began in France in 1935, and it was inspired by Stalin.
Of the Soviet Union.
That's right. And Stalin said to the French Communist Party, fascism is the major threat, Hitler is the major threat.
Mussolini and so on.
Well, he was more concerned with Hitler.
Yeah.
And Mussolini was not a direct threat to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, Mussolini was concentrating on the Mediterranean.
That's right. Mussolini is basically the second fiddle. Mussolini as
He became second fiddle.
yeah, well, Churchill had the best definition.
Yeah.
Mussolini is a jackal at the table of the wolf. Adolf Hitler was the wolf.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, in any case, to get back to the Popular Front, the Popular Front was a coalition of liberal democracy, social democracy, and the third group were the communists.
Right. And the social democracy included various socialist parties.
France had a very large socialist party, and they had a weak communist party, and they had a strong liberal party in France, which was called the Radical Socialists. They were not very radical, and they were not very socialist. They would be called liberals in Spain, in America, or in England. But you see, they called themselves the Radical Socialists. It meant radical on the church question.
Okay.
And they wanted to have the name socialism in order to take votes away from the real socialists. So they called themselves the Radical Socialists, but they were really a conservative center party.
Right. Well, we are so used to thinking of two major parties, the Democrats and
Right.
Republicans here, that we don't appreciate sometimes how complicated politics, governmental politics, has been in European countries,
That's right.
and especially in France and in Spain. And
And in Italy, as far as that goes.
right, even today, there are a number of different parties in
Right.
each of those countries. But one of the other things that was different about Spain was that they had a tiny communist party
That's
at
correct.
the beginning of the Spanish Civil War,
That's true.
which grew during the Civil War
That's
because
true.
of the aid that was given by Stalin
That's
by
true.
the Soviet Union.
That's right.
But they had several socialist parties, and one of the prime ministers during the Republic was the head of the Socialist Union, what they call the UGT, Largo Caballero, the big horse. Literally, his name means the big horse. But he was a prime minister of the Republic in part of 36 and part of 37. But in addition, they had a liberal party, more of a democratic, leftist party, and they had a lot of anarchists. This was unusual.
Unusual
had
for
more,
Spain.
Spain had more anarchists
That's right.
than any other European country.
Right. However, in Russia, the early Russia, before 1917, had a large anarchist movement.
Yes.
And they were called social revolutionaries.
Uh-huh.
And Russia and Spain are similar to that because similar to each other because the Spanish anarchists and the Russian social revolutionaries always lose because being anarchists, they are so individualistic that usually the socialists and the liberals are able to discipline the anarchists and come out on top.
Right.
So that when Spanish democracy reappeared after the death of Franco, under the chairmanship of the new king, the Spanish anarchists got only about 2% of the vote. People had learned the lesson that anarchy is not a very successful, practical
Governing party.
Yeah.
They are against government, very much
Against all
against government.
However, they actually had what they call anarcho-syndicalism.
Yes.
After you overthrow the government, it's the labor unions that rule in a kind of a government. But it was highly decentralized. The textile union, the printers union, it was sort of like the American union. Remember, you had the locals, so that this Madrid unions and the Barcelona unions were hostile to one another.
Well, it was a pretty complicated situation, but as we say, this group of leftist parties came to power in February of 1936 and began instituting some of their ideas, in addition to which the people who had lost obviously were not satisfied. The church, the big landowners, the military were not. For instance, what happened to Franco himself, who had been head of a military academy, a hero of the Moroccan Wars, the youngest general in Europe, etc., had been exiled, so to speak, to the Canary Islands, which are off the coast of Africa.
They were already suspicious of a coup. That is, the government, the liberal government, said, well, if he's out on the Canary Islands, he's safe, away from us.
Yeah. And they, so they sent some of the top military people. I can't remember, there was another general who was sent to the Balearic Islands, which are in the Mediterranean, but are ruled by Spain.
Yes.
And actually, the leader of this military rising had been in exile for some time. His name was General Sanjurjo. He was in exile in Portugal.
Well, he tried a coup d'etat in 1932 and lost.
And so he went into exile in Portugal. And he was supposed to be the leader of the new the military uprising in July of 36. However, he died in a plane crash immediately in Portugal. He never even made it to Spain. So that was the end of him. But he had been plotting with several other military men, particularly a general called Mola, who was, he was in Spain, in, mainland Spain. He hadn't been sent that far away, but he was...
well, he was in a peculiar region known as the Navarre.
The Navarre.
This is a Basque region. And they were different than...
Right up by the French border.
Right, and they were different than the Castellanos, who are Castile, Madrid. And they're different than Barcelona. And it was a kind of a rural territory.
Yeah. Plus, there's always been a sort of a feeling in some parts of Spain. You mentioned the Basques. Also, the Catalans were Barcelona.
That's Barcelona, right.
Catalonia.
Right.
There has been a movement for centuries, actually, for sort of an independence from Madrid, from the Castilians.
Right.
By the Basques in northern Spain and the Catalans in northeastern Spain. So that was just one more, bit of the
Franco called these people the separatists.
Separatists, yes.
And he believed in the centralization of government, and when he took over, he made the Basque language illegal, and he made the Catalan language illegal. Of course, in 1975, when he died, those languages all came back.
Right. But they had been strong during the Civil War. The Basque region was a scene of a lot of fighting in the middle of 1937, and Catalonia was essentially the last part to fall before Madrid finally gave up on the end of March 1939. Many people, many of the Republicans had fled to Catalonia and sought exile in France eventually, across the border. But then Franco's forces took over Barcelona itself and closed the French border off. And the possibility of aid from France, which had occurred during the Civil War, was cut off in that way. So, well, anyway, we were talking about the outbreak. And one of the interesting things is that there was not only a popular front in Spain, but another popular front would help out the Spaniards, then the Spanish Popular Front eventually, and that was in France itself.
Yes, but the Popular Front in France was more conservative than the Spanish Popular Front.
Yeah, that's true.
And there was also a Popular Front in Czechoslovakia.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm.
And that was more conservative. And then there was a very left-wing Popular Front government in Chile.
Uh-huh.
And Franklin Roosevelt's ambassador, a man by the name of Claude Bowers, was very sympathetic to the Republic. And
but he was in exile, actually, right across the French border in Biarritz.
well, you're talking about after the war got going.
After the war got going,
but he
right.
went there in 33 when it was all peaceful.
Yes.
But he predicted in 33, 34, 35, 36, he predicted and sent letters to Roosevelt. There is going to be a coup d'etat here. There's going to be a civil war. So the Civil War was not a surprise.
It was not a surprise to the people who were really
On the ground in Spain, you know.
up in politics and seeing what was going on there, because during the Spanish Republic, the early days, it was quite pretty radical.
But what
right
I was going to
away.
say about Chile, when the
about
Civil
Chile?
War was all over, Roosevelt had to find a new ambassador.
For Chile.
No, for Spain. He
For
wanted
Spain.
somebody friendly to the new Franco-victorious regime.
Right, he had
So
to.
he reached to a very conservative Episcopalian
Uh-huh.
who was serving as the ambassador to Argentina, which
All
is a
right.
very conservative country.
Uh-huh.
So Roosevelt's ambassador in Argentina became the new ambassador to Franco-Spain because the high Episcopalian Church cooperate with the Catholic Church on government of religion.
Yeah.
In other words, the Episcopalians are very latitudinarian. You have left-wing and right-wing Episcopalians.
Yes.
But theologically, it's very Anglo-Catholic types
There are Anglo-Catholic types.
who are very close to Rome, okay?
What they call high church.
High church, right.
As opposed to the low church
You got it.
Episcopalians.
You got it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well-
Bowers then became
Bowers.
the former ambassador in Spain, Popular Front, went to Chile,
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
and he was the ambassador way up into the 60s. And it was the Chilean government which gave him more honor than the American government ever made.
But it's interesting that Bowers was one of the supporters of Franklin Roosevelt early on.
That's true.
He supported him when he was first nominated for the presidency
You
in
got it.
1932.
He was a journalist. He worked for the
Claude
New York
Bowers.
World. He worked for the New York World.
You worked in his papers, didn't you?
That's
You went
correct.
to Indiana, I think it was.
Well, he was born in Indiana,
Uh-huh.
and he left his papers to Bloomington.
Yeah.
So I looked at the Bowers papers.
Well, and he spent the Civil War itself in exile just across the border in France, in Biarritz, I think.
I don't think exile is the right word. He was not kicked out. The embassies in Madrid, the British embassy, the Norwegian embassy, the American embassy, could not stay in Madrid from their point of view because it was
the-
taken over by the unions. And the conservative British aristocratic diplomats and all of the European diplomats said, well, if you go up to Biarritz on the border with Navarre, you can be the ambassador up there where you're safe.
Yeah.
And this
Well,
became a hotbed of intelligence.
Uh-huh.
Franco could tap into the European diplomatic elite. Okay,
right.
so the British ambassador and the French ambassador was kind of conservative socially and not particularly interested in revolution in Spain.
yes.
And
Well,
Madrid was a revolutionary city.
In addition, Bob, there was a tradition for the ambassadors to leave hot Madrid in the middle of the
That's
summer.
right.
Most of them weren't there anyway on
That's
July
right.
18th.
That's right. It broke out in July while they were already up there.
Yeah, they were
Right, you got
already
it.
there on summer vacation.
July is a beautiful month to make a coup d'etat.
Well, and that's when the move was made. And like I say, this General Mola who was in there,
Robert, we've reached a halfway point.
okay,
Lois and I are husband and wife, and we have been discussing the Spanish Civil War, a problem which I thought as a problem in 1954, because I was concerned about the fate of American democracy when the United States under Eisenhower was moving to the right and becoming more and more conservative. And Lois was also a liberal Democrat from Stanford, and we happened to meet at the University of Michigan, and we were both interested in the Spanish Civil War. And of course, she helped me in writing my major book on the Spanish Civil War.
right.
And so
Here
this
it
is our discussion. Robert and Lois Whealey. Athens
Hitler
Speakout.
and Spain is the title, the Nazi role in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
There you go.
There it is.
And Lois
it-
did a lot of work on the footnotes and the style and improved that book.
Well, and it finally came out in 1987?
1889.
1989. After Bob had worked on it for 30 years, probably, by
That's true.
then. But he'd done research in Washington, D.C.
Right.
and the German
and
archives.
the reason why it was so long in coming out is that you had to know German, you had to know French, you had to know Portuguese,
Well, a little bit.
and you had to know Italian,
Some.
and
Spanish.
of course Spanish. But the difficulty was Russian. But the Russians had the archives closed anyway.
Right.
So my book came out in '89 before the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there are new Russian sources available that are talking about the secret Soviet intervention from the point of view of Stalin.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the Republic. For
And
the
it's
Republicans.
published by the Kentucky Press.
University
University
of
of
Kentucky
Kentucky
Press,
Press.
in Lexington, Kentucky.
And the picture on the front, it's not exactly a picture, but it's interesting that it sort of shows the Nazi
Swastika.
swastika.
It was kind of
This
illegal and kind
gray-
of taboo to publish a swastika in the
this-
United States.
This gray area, if you look at it closely, you'll see it looks
Yeah.
kind of like a
And some of the people
swastika.
could detect that hidden swastika, and others couldn't see it.
Because the Nazis played a very big role
And
in
that is the
Civil
color.
War.
This is the color of the Wehrmacht.
Black
The
and
gray,
red.
the gray, the
Gray.
gray, and then they had white and red on their cap.
Mm-hmm.
Now the Gestapo had all black.
Ah,
The
Well-
Gestapo were black shirts. The SA were brown shirts.
Mm-hmm.
And Mussolini's had black shirts, and
Mm-hmm.
Franco then wore the blue shirts. The blue
Blue
shirts
shirts.
were the shirt.
Falange.
Was the Falange.
The Spanish Falange.
Right.
Were the blue shirts.
Yeah.
And they eventually fought against, a bunch of them fought against the Soviets in World War II
Yeah,
as
they-
quote, volunteers
Yeah,
they sent by Franco.
No, they were semi-volunteers.
Yeah, semi-Franco.
Well, they were volunteers.
Yeah, right, yeah.
The point was that Franco was supported by the Legion Condor from Germany
Yes,
and by the Corps Truppo Volontario of the Italians.
right.
And then Hitler collected a big war debt from Spain from this Legion Condor. And then when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Franco, in order to pay his debt back, said, I will send the Blue Division, named after the Phalange, to Leningrad and help you stamp out communism.
That was during World War II, after the time we're talking about.
Right.
But this is one of the other connections
That's
between
correct.
the Spanish
That's
Civil
right.
War and World War II.
Right.
And this fact that the Italian fascists and the German Nazis helped Franco come to power
And
with
they
the
helped-
military
and
aid.
They, along with the Romanians and the Hungarians, they had an expeditionary corps to help Hitler.
Yeah.
And then when Stalin won, he smashed Hungary and Romania
Right.
and Bulgaria
You
with an
know,
iron fist.
Right, yeah.
But he never reached Spain.
Too far away. That was a saving thing for them. Yeah, too far away. Well, anyway, we've given some of the background to 1936 and the fact that the military uprising occurred, and that Franco came to power because he was the guy who successfully got German aid.
That's correct.
He was in the Canary Islands, as I say, in sort of exile, but he got this British plane that flew him to Morocco.
Right.
And then immediately the German man who was in charge of the German Nazis in Spanish Morocco,
The party. Yeah.
the party in Spanish Morocco, a man named Bernhardt.
Yeah.
Well, he was a lieutenant in that, but he was the one who flew on in this German plane that had stopped
We're talking about
there.
a Lufthansa passenger plane.
A Lufthansa.
The Lufthansa had air service from Berlin to
Right.
Paris, to Marseille, to Barcelona, Madrid. Then it comes down to Tangier, and then they go to the Canary Islands for gasoline and fly across the Atlantic
Right.
and set up a Lufthansa in Latin America.
Right.
And of course, the condor is a bird up in the Andes Mountains.
Right. The
So
huge
that's where they
bird.
got the name, the Legion
The
Condor.
Legion Condor. Yeah.
They disguised themselves.
So Bernhardt flew to Berlin in the Lufthansa plane and talked to the German officials, and was even taken on July 25th, which is just 1 week after the beginning of the war.
Well, Bernhardt met Hitler
Bernhardt talked to Hitler himself
through Hess, through Rudolf Hess.
through Rudolf Hess, who was head of the
Right.
the German party abroad, the Ausland organization. And here was Hitler enjoying himself at a Wagnerian opera. And at the end of the Wagnerian opera, he met with these German emissaries and agreed that the Germans would send aid.
Airlift.
Airlift, that was the first aid.
Right.
Was to airlift some of the Moroccan troops.
Operation Valkyrie.
Valkyrie.
Named after this opera.
Yeah.
So Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe became Hitler's major agent in Spain.
Yes, they did.
Right. And Hitler delegated it to Goering.
Yes. Goering was the one who pulled most of the strings, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah, he was named that. The very next day, the 26th of July, they agreed to give this aid. And so the Lufthansa plane went right back to Morocco and started airlifting groups of Spanish Moroccan troops
Right.
to the mainland.
Yeah. First airlift in history.
Yeah, it was One of the other things,
I think it took 17 minutes to go from Morocco to Cadiz.
is that
And
right?
That was a little city on the peninsula,
Yeah,
which
on
was
the
already
coast
in the
of
hands
Spain.
of the Franco supporters. Okay.
Right, yeah, the military supporters, the
Right.
coup supporters.
Right.
Yes, it was, and so Hitler was in
So
on the
then
very
this
beginning.
Moroccan army invades from the south, from Cadiz up to toward Madrid, and eventually there's the siege in Madrid.
Right, they were in Toledo in September.
That's right.
They were already up to Toledo and Madrid, which is, central Spain. I mean, hundreds of miles. They took over very quickly.
That was the so-called capital of the Popular Front, but the Popular Front went into exile. That's why they went into exile. They
They-
voluntarily went to Valencia,
Which is
Out-
on the coast of
out on
Mediterranean
the
coast.
Catalan coast.
Mediterranean
Yeah,
coast.
correct. And they could get aid from the Soviet Union all along the Catalan coast, from Barcelona all the way down to Alicante. And one of the strategic wins for the Mussolini intervention was the Battle of Malaga,
Yes,
down near Gibraltar,
yes.
in which he cuts off Popular Front any further west than Malaga.
Yeah.
And then
And
it was
they
a
took
fight
over.
between the East Coast and the West Coast.
Right. Well, one of the things that happened immediately, on July 18th, 1920th, was fighting in the streets.
Right.
And the military took over successfully, for instance, in Sevilla,
Right.
in Seville,
Right.
right away, and they kept it during the whole war, even though for a while, there were Republicans around them. But they had that
They
immediately.
voted for the Popular Front. Sevilla voted for the Popular Front.
But it was taken over by Queipo de Llano.
You got it.
Yeah.
Propagandist.
Right. Now, what happened in Barcelona was that the general who went into revolution against the Spanish Republic lost
Right.
because the Catalans were so dead set against him.
Right.
There were a lot of anarchists there and so on.
What
we have a
was,
question.
What was Franklin Roosevelt doing at this time? It just-
Franklin Roosevelt was sitting in Washington, and Eleanor was very sympathetic to the Republic. The Nation magazine was very sympathetic to the Republic. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was a centrist. He had to pacify the conservative South. He had to pacify the Roman Catholic Church, very important for the Democratic Party. So he wasn't going to take any stand against Franco because of the church and the conservatives. So he then believed in the Non-Intervention Committee. Now, the Non-Intervention Committee was set up by the British government.
Yes. And the
it-
French.
And the French conservative government reluctantly
They
signed
went,
on to it.
they went along
But the
with it.
Non-Intervention Committee was a false committee set up in London, and they prohibited the export of weapons and men to the two sides fighting in Spain. Well, Hitler ignored that.
Sure.
He just took,
Chamberlain in charge at that time?
He was in charge.
well, he wasn't, he wasn't.
Not
Chamberlain
right
was
then,
the
but
lead in the cabinet. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was in charge of the money.
He became
The Prime Minister was an
later.
old man by the name of Baldwin,
Yeah.
who was essentially a figurehead.
Baldwin, yeah.
So Baldwin went along with the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office said,
Non-intervention.
Non-Intervention Committee. And there were 26 countries in Europe which was supposedly keep men and weapons out of Spain. However, Latin America was not part of the committee. So if you had a Latin American flag, you got in. So Mussolini didn't have any problem from Sardinia to Barcelona. It was a short ride. No problem to get into the Balearic Islands. He had close. Now, Hitler had a little longer trip, and they used Panamanian flags, smuggled all of the weapons in they needed. Okay. Now the Soviet Union didn't have much of a sea power. They hired merchant ships from England private enterprise. They set up this little phony firm called the Stanhope Committee. They had it was the Stanhopes, the Stan. It was a number of ships, all called Stan. Okay, Stanforth was the guy who set it up, and he smuggled weapons for cash. They got Polish weapons, Mexican weapons, World War II. Second-hand weapons.
They didn't have good weapons like the Italians and Germans.
Had first-class stuff.
Yeah.
And the Me-109, the best fighter aircraft, was sent to Spain early in the campaign. And the Italians had a pretty good fighter by the name of the Fiat 32, the CR-32.
We have some pictures of those, actually.
Right. So Hitler and Mussolini got air power pretty soon.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Well, we were talking about the Non-Intervention Committee, which had humorously been called the Interventionist Committee, also known as the Non-Intervention Committee. They intervened essentially on the side of the military, Franco and his generals and so on.
Well, it was the way it was interpreted.
Yeah.
This was not on paper.
No, it wasn't on paper, but it was, in fact, it was the Intervention Committee because they would not help the Republic.
That's correct. And
Now
and
the
Roosevelt
Mexicans did. The Mexicans did help the Republic somewhat.
The Mexicans had a revolutionary regime under Cardenas, and he was sympathetic to the left.
You know, I was just reading an interesting article in the Volunteer, which is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives magazine, about the fact that in Mexico there were a lot of people who were opposed to the Mexican intervention in favor of the Second Spanish Republic. Not the top guy, as you point out, but the church,
Yes,
the
sure.
entrepreneurs,
Right.
the Spaniards in exile, who were right-wingers and so on,
Right.
who were in Mexico, were opposed to the
But
Mexican
then after
intervention.
the war, a lot of left-wingers went to Mexico
That's
City.
true. Many went in exile to Mexico after the war. And you know, Bob, there are even connections of this Abraham Lincoln Brigade people who helped on the left, the Spanish Republic, right here in Athens. When we first came to town, there was a man in the English department, an older gentleman, named James Norman Schmidt. And he was a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade who wrote a novel about the last month of the Spanish Civil War called The Fell of Dark. So, you know, you find connections all over. One of the people who teaches in Oberlin, Sebastian Faber, who teaches Hispanic studies up there, has been the chairman of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archive, ALBA they call it, for a number of years. So you have these people who are sympathetic to especially to the Americans, who are mostly left-wingers, many of them communists, others sympathizers, who went to fight in the international brigades for the Spanish Republic. This was, they first started there in, I guess, November of '36. But in the meantime, you mentioned about Stalin. Why was Stalin so interested in Spain? It wasn't just political. He had an economic stake. What happened to the Spanish gold?
Well, no, the Spanish gold is a Spanish problem. But let's talk about Stalin. Stalin agreed with an idea of Churchill way back in '35.
Yeah.
Churchill says the only way you're going to stop Hitler is to have what he called the Grand Alliance.
The Grand
And the Grand
Alliance.
Alliance was France, England, and Stalin in order to check Adolf Hitler.
Right, and the Italians,
Right.
for that matter.
Okay, but Churchill was considered persona non grata by the Chamberlain government the Chamberlain government was interested in money.
And
And Chamberlain
pacification.
said England cannot fight a second world war. It doesn't have the money.
And it's true, they
So
didn't.
this Churchill is a madman. And Churchill then was in exile. But Churchill was gaining
He was out of
sympathy
power.
as time went on because Hitler remilitarized the Vineland.
Yeah, that was in March of 36.
He got an alliance with Japan called the Anti-Comintern Pact.
That was in the fall of 1936.
Directed against Soviet Union. Then he got the Axis deal with Mussolini.
That was the end of October
So the
36.
balance of power was tipping toward Hitler.
Right.
And then Hitler says, we need to take over Austria. Well, they took over Austria without firing a shot.
That was in the March of 38.
And the British
War was
and
still
French
on in
government
Spain.
were so disarmed, they couldn't even issue a protest. It took them totally by surprise.
Yeah.
Then Mussolini says, Hitler says, next is Czechoslovakia. I have a plan. If you don't give up the Sudetenland, which was a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, we're going to invade.
Right.
Operation Green, that was what it was called, Operation Green.
That came to a crisis point in September of 1938.
Yeah, but
meanwhile, everything was still going on in
Chamberlain says,
Spain.
we can
fighting.
compromise this. We can compromise this. So the French were going, see, under the French-Soviet treaty, the French were obligated to fight for Czechoslovakia, and the Soviets were going to fight on the same side in order to protect Czechoslovakian independence. So the Munich Agreement was a deal on the part of Chamberlain and Hitler and Mussolini and the French Foreign Minister, Daladier, who didn't want to go there,
Yeah.
but signed it
reluctant,
under
but he
protest.
signed, yeah.
to sign the Sudetenland over to Hitler without firing a shot.
And then all the fortifications that were on the
That's right,
Sudetenland
right, and-
on the border with Germany were taken over by the Germans.
That's right. And
Which meant that
right.
in March of 39,
You got it.
Hitler just marched right into Prague.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And
That was how the war gradually came to be.
Right.
And an important part of it was what was going on in Spain at the same time.
that's right. It was foretold, okay? For Hitler, Spain was a smokescreen to have the Italians, the British, and the French, and the Soviets get all interested in that and leave him to have the free hand to gradually move into Eastern Europe one by one.
Right, and he sent specialists to Spain, tank specialists and
Right. Right.
air specialists and so on. And those people were trained there, and they were trained in blitzkrieg tactics,
Right.
which they used
Right.
to take over Europe in
Right.
1940.
That's right.
And-
Speer was bombing London after he had experience in Spain.
He had
As a-
bombed
that's right.
Barcelona,
That's right.
and probably he was involved with Guernica.
That's true.
Guernica was in April of 37.
Right.
It was a tiny town in the Basque Country.
And that became a memorial to the defeat of the Basques and was a great painting by Pablo Picasso.
Right.
And it's one of the most valuable paintings of the 20th century. It was held in the not in the Metropolitan,
It
but
was
the
in
Modern Museum.
I first saw it as
New York.
in New York as a
original.
college student
And I did
in
too.
1949.
And I saw it in
It was in the Museum of Modern Art.
I saw it a year before, in 2 years, in 47.
Okay.
My English teacher took me there, and the class went there.
It was a huge black and white and gray painting.
And then Picasso said at the end of the war, when Spain becomes a democracy, it will be sent back to the Spanish Museum. And that was fulfilled in 1980.
yeah.
Well, soon after 86, after Juan Carlos, I think it was about 10 years after.
Well, it was I think it was in 81 or so.
81,
something
they
like
said,
that.
okay,
After it was pretty certain, after the death of Franco in 1975.
now I
and Juan
understand the
Carlos
Basques
came to
have
the
taken
king.
it back to Basque land.
Yeah.
They got it out of Madrid.
Oh,
I think so.
well, anyway,
I-
it was at the Prado for quite some time.
That's right.
That's true.
Well, maybe they only had it up as an exhibit.
That could be.
Up in
It might
there,
have been an special exhibit,
Yeah.
yeah. So there are many connections. For instance, the most famous American novel about the Spanish Civil War was by Ernest Hemingway, called For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Right.
And that was made into a movie as well.
And that hero was based on a real hero.
A real American
Robert
hero,
Jordan was based on a man by the name of Merriman.
Bob Merriman, and he was from Nevada, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Lois, you have 2 minutes remaining.
Well, we're just about over.
Well, maybe I ought to summarize this in my 2 minutes, because I would like to define democracy again. Do you know what the First Amendment says?
Yes, I do, but let's go on.
Do you want to see it? I can read it if you don't want to read it.
No, let's, and what, do you have another amendment there, too?
No, I have the First Amendment.
Okay, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Okay. I think that the Republican Party is in limbo because it's only interested in the Second Amendment, and very few Republicans even know what the First Amendment says.
That could be.
And this is going to be my slogan for this present campaign for election. What does Trump believe in? Can Trump cite the First Amendment? Does
Well,
he have any idea?
He's some distance from the Spanish Civil War, and Bob is a specialist on the Spanish Civil War, having written a book on Hitler and Spain about the intervention done by the Nazis to help to bring Franco to power.
And we belong to a committee called Democracy Over Corporations,
Right.
and we have a difficult time preaching that. So anyway, the end of my show is a slogan: debate is the oxygen of democracy. I appreciate you coming here to review this vital debate.
Okay, dear. Lois Whealey signing off.